Music has a way of sticking with us, not just the melody, but the stories behind the songs. In this special compilation, we dive into 5 iconic tracks that shaped generations and the heartbreak, pain, and real-life experiences that inspired them. A folk legend writing about her crumbling relationship with Bob Dylan. A power ballad that haunted its writers so deeply that they took their own lives. A teenage outcast pouring her loneliness into poetry. A father who realized too late he had become the man he feared. And a rock icon watching his friends die one by one. These are not just songs. They are confessions, warnings, goodbyes. In the next hour, you will discover the true stories behind 5 songs that turned personal tragedy into timeless art. It all starts with a phone call, a sudden, unexpected ring that shattered a decade of silence. The voice on the other end? Bob Dylan. And just like that, Joan Baez was no longer in the present. She was transported back to a crummy hotel room in Greenwich Village, sometime around 1964 or 65. The scent of cigarette smoke, the echo of guitar strings, and the ache of a love that had always lived somewhere between the lines came flooding back. That phone call, filled with the weight of memory, became the spark that lit the fire behind one of the most haunting songs Baez would ever write, Diamonds and Rust. Baez and Dylan were more than just icons of a generation. They were once deeply entwined in each other's lives. Together, they helped shape the American folk revival of the 1960s. But behind the harmonies and the protests was a love story far more complicated than most fans realized. Baez adored him, his mind, his music, his mystery. She brought him into her spotlight, shared her stage, and stood beside him as his legend grew. But Dylan was elusive. One day, he made her feel like the center of his universe. The next, he seemed like he was already gone. Baez would later reflect that he couldn't make up his mind about her, always keeping things vague. There were times she thought they might get married, and times when she felt like they were barely even friends. After their split, Baez tried to move on. She married, had a child, and built a life that didn't revolve around him. But every now and then, he'd call. Out of the blue. No reason, no warning, just Dylan crashing back into her carefully rebuilt world and stirring up feelings that never really left. The phone call that inspired Diamonds and Rust was one of those moments. But instead of brushing it off, Baez sat down and began to write. What followed wasn't just a song, it was a poetic reckoning. Take the opening lines. Well, I'll be damned, here comes your ghost again. But that's not unusual. It's just that the moon is full, and you happen to call. These lines are deceptively simple, but they carry immense emotional weight. The word ghost is doing heavy lifting. It's not just about Dylan, but about all the unresolved feelings that still haunt her. The line about the full moon suggests a sense of fate, of cosmic timing, as if even the universe conspires to resurrect old pain. Then there's this devastating stanza. Now you're telling me you're not nostalgic? Then give me another word for it, you who are so good with words and at keeping things vague. Here, Baez flips the script. She challenges Dylan with the very tools he's known for, language and ambiguity. It's part heartbreak, part indictment. The brilliance of these lines lies in how they merge wit with sorrow. She's not pleading, she's confronting. And yet beneath the sharpness, you can still hear the ache. But perhaps no line captures the soul of the song better than the chorus itself. And if you're offering me diamonds and rust, I've already paid. It's an unforgettable metaphor. Diamonds, the beautiful, dazzling moments. Rust, the corrosion left behind. Love in this song is both treasure and ruin. And Baez isn't asking for anything back. She's saying she already paid the price. The chorus stands as one of the most emotionally potent in folk music. Cutting, elegant, and deeply human. Diamonds and Rust is a song filled with melancholy, memory, and razor-sharp honesty. Baez initially told Dylan it was about her ex-husband, David Harris, but the lyrics made it clear this wasn't about Harris. This was about Dylan. It was a portrait of a relationship that still loomed large in her heart, years after it had ended. Baez has said the song is about how time can turn dark charcoal into diamonds or shiny metal into rust. It's not a bitter song. It's an honest one, a song that captures what it feels like to look back on love with both tenderness and clarity. Diamonds and Rust became a hit, reaching the top 40 in the US and serving as the title track for her gold-selling 1975 album. But it wasn't just a commercial success, it was an artistic triumph. After years of performing other people's songs, Baez returned to songwriting with renewed fire. Critics who had once dismissed her lyricism were silenced by the depth and precision of this track. It was proof that Joan Baez, the voice of protest and peace, also knew how to write about heartbreak with devastating precision. The story continued when Dylan invited her to join him on the Rolling Thunder Revue tour. There they were again, on stage, side by side, singing through the tension and the history. In her memoir, And a Voice to Sing With, Baez recounts talking to Dylan about the song during rehearsals. He didn't say much. Maybe he didn't have to. The song said it all. Over the years, Diamonds and Rust has been covered by a wide range of artists, from folk duos to the heavy metal band Judas Priest, each drawn to its poetic sorrow. But none of them could replicate the raw, lived-in emotion of Baez's version, because only she knew what those memories really felt like. Only she could sing them with that mixture of pain, clarity, and grace. The brilliance of Diamonds and Rust lies in how deeply personal it is and how universal it feels. Everyone has someone they remember with both affection and ache, someone who changed them, someone who still lives in the quiet spaces between their thoughts. That's what Joan Baez captured so perfectly, a love that was never simple, a goodbye that never fully settled. More than just a folk song, Diamonds and Rust is a testament to the power of memory and the music that rises from it. It shows how art can turn pain into poetry, and how even the most tangled relationships can leave behind something achingly beautiful. Joan Baez didn't write it for the charts. She wrote it because the past came knocking, and because sometimes when the ghosts return, the only way to quiet them is to sing. A love song becomes a curse. Two men create a masterpiece that conquers the world, and both die without seeing a penny from it. This is the story of Without You, the ballad that made millionaires out of everyone who touched it, except the two songwriters who poured their hearts into every note. Pete Ham and Tom Evans wrote a song so powerful that Paul McCartney called it the killer song of all time. Harry Nilsson took it to #1. Mariah Carey did the same 22 years later. Over 180 artists have recorded it. It has been played at weddings, funerals, in films, on television, and in restaurants across the globe for more than 50 years. But Pete Ham never met his daughter. Tom Evans was found hanging from a willow tree by his 6-year-old son. Both died penniless, destroyed by a music industry that celebrated their genius while stealing their future. This is their story. This is the tragedy of Badfinger. Swansea, Wales, 1961. Pete Ham is a 15-year-old with a guitar and a dream that burns brighter than the gray skies over his working-class neighborhood. He's not just talented, he's extraordinary. By 17, he's fronting a local band called the Panthers, playing covers in youth clubs and church halls, his voice already carrying that aching vulnerability that would one day break hearts around the world. Pete Ham wasn't supposed to be a rock star. He was supposed to work in a factory, maybe settle down with a local girl and live a quiet life. But there was something in him that couldn't be contained, a melodic gift that seemed to flow from somewhere beyond himself. His friends would later say that writing songs was as natural to Pete as breathing. He didn't struggle or strain. The music just came. 300 miles north in Liverpool, the crucible of British rock and roll, another young musician was finding his path. Tom Evans. Where Pete was gentle and introspective, Tom was fiery and passionate. A bass guitarist with movie star looks and a voice that could soar to the rafters, Tom had been playing in Liverpool bands since the early 60s, riding the wave of Beatlemania that had turned his hometown into the center of the musical universe. By 1968, fate brought them together. Pete's band, the Ivies, needed a bass player. Tom Evans walked through the door and something clicked. Pete and Tom weren't just bandmates. They became brothers, collaborators, the creative engine of what would soon become Badfinger. And then came the break every struggling musician dreams of, the Beatles' Apple Records. The label that promised to nurture artists, to protect them from the sharks and vultures of the music industry. Paul McCartney himself took an interest in the Ivies, seeing something of the Beatles' own early innocence in these young Welsh and English lads. In 1968, they signed with Apple. In 1969, they became Badfinger. And in 1970, they released Come and Get It. a song written and produced by McCartney that shot to number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100. Badfinger had arrived. They were hailed as the next Beatles, the torchbearers of melodic rock. 4 talented musicians, Pete Ham on guitar and vocals, Tom Evans on bass and vocals, Joey Molland on guitar and vocals, and Mike Gibbons on drums, who could write, sing, and play with a sophistication that belied their youth. They appeared in the Beatles' film The Magic Christian. They recorded at Abbey Road Studios. They socialized with rock royalty. The future looked golden, but in the music industry, nothing is ever quite as golden as it seems. Late 1970, Badfinger is working on their second album, No Dice. The pressure is on. Their debut album had been a modest success, but Come and Get It had been written by McCartney. The band needed to prove they could create hits on their own, that they weren't just pretty faces propped up by Beatles connections. Pete Ham sits at the piano in the studio. It's late. The others have gone home, but Pete stays, as he always does, chasing a melody that has been haunting him. He's thinking about love, about his girlfriend, about the ache of separation, about what it means to need someone so desperately that the thought of being without them is unbearable. His fingers find the chords. Simple, descending, melancholic. And then the words start coming. He writes the verses quickly, almost automatically. The song pours out of him in a rush of emotion, but something isn't quite right. The chorus, the emotional climax, won't come. He works at it for hours, but can't find the perfect expression of that devastating feeling. Enter Tom Evans. When Pete plays him the unfinished song the next day, Tom immediately feels it. He hears what Pete is reaching for. And in that mysterious alchemy that happens between true collaborators, Tom writes the chorus, the soaring, heartbreaking refrain that would become one of the most recognized passages in popular music history. Together, Pete and Tom have created something extraordinary. A song that captures the universal experience of heartbreak with devastating simplicity. No elaborate metaphors, no clever wordplay, just raw, honest emotion wrapped in a melody that seems to have existed forever, waiting for someone to discover it. But here's the cruel irony. Pete and Tom don't think much of it. They record it for No Dice, but it's buried as an album track. Not a single, not a priority, just another song in a catalog of what they assume will be many more. They have no idea that they've just written their masterpiece, that this song will outlive them, outlast them, and ultimately define them. When No Dice is released in November 1970, critics praise Badfinger's songwriting. The album sells respectably. But Without You barely registers. It's a deep cut. A footnote. And then one day in 1971, a phone call comes that will change everything. Harry Nilsson is listening to No Dice on a friend's sound system. He's already a successful artist, a singer's singer, beloved by critics and fellow musicians, if not quite by the masses. He has an extraordinary voice, 3 octaves of pure emotion, and he's always looking for the perfect song to showcase it. When Without You plays, Nilsson stops mid-conversation. He rewinds the track, plays it again and again. "That's my song," he says. "That's the song I've been waiting for." Nilsson books studio time with producer Richard Perry, one of the best in the business. They approach Without You not as a simple cover, but as a grand emotional statement. They add orchestration, sweeping strings that build and build. They shape the arrangement like a classical piece, starting small and intimate, then exploding into a cathartic crescendo. And Nilsson sings it with every ounce of passion his remarkable voice can muster. The result is transcendent. When Nilsson's version of Without You is released in October 1971, it doesn't just become a hit, it becomes a phenomenon. It reaches number 1 in the United States, number 1 in the United Kingdom, number 1 in over a dozen countries worldwide. It sells millions of copies. It earns Grammy nominations. It makes Harry Nilsson a household name. And for Pete Ham and Tom Evans, it should have been the beginning of a fairy tale. They're songwriters who've just written the biggest hit in the world. Publishing royalties should be pouring in, recognition should be following. This is their yesterday, their something, a standard destined to generate income for decades. Except that's not what happens, because between Pete Ham, Tom Evans, and the money that Without You is generating stands a man named Stan Polly, intact. Stan Polly doesn't look like a villain. In his well-tailored suits and thick-rimmed glasses, he looks like every other businessman in the music industry. He speaks smoothly, makes promises easily, and somewhere along the way, Badfinger, Four talented but naive young musicians signed over control of their careers to him. Pauly becomes their manager in 1970. He convinces them that he has their best interests at heart, that he'll protect them, guide them, make them rich. The boys from Swansea and Liverpool, who know how to write songs but nothing about publishing mechanical royalties or contract negotiations, trust him completely. It's the worst mistake they'll ever make. As Without You conquers the world, while Harry Nilsson performs it on television and radio stations play it endlessly while the money starts flowing. Stan Pauly controls where it goes. He sets up a labyrinth of companies and offshore accounts. Money that should have gone to Badfinger disappears into these corporate shells. When Pete and Tom ask about their royalties, Pauly shows them complicated paperwork, makes vague promises, and assures them everything is being handled properly. The band members are living on modest weekly allowances while their song is making millions. But it's worse than simple theft. Pauly's mismanagement creates a nightmare of legal complications. Publishing rights become tangled. Royalty payments are frozen in disputes. Warner Bros., Badfinger's new record label after Apple Records collapses, withholds funds because no one can determine where the money is supposed to go. And through it all, Badfinger keeps working. They release Straight Up in 1971, an album many critics consider their masterpiece, produced by George Harrison and Todd Rundgren. They release Ass in 1973 and Wish You Were Here in 1974. Pete Ham continues to write beautiful songs, day after day, Baby Blue, melodies that showcase his extraordinary gift. But the joy is draining out of it. The innocence is gone. Pete and Tom start to realize what's happened to them, that they've been robbed, that the man they trusted has betrayed them, that the success of Without You, rather than setting them up for life, has trapped them in a web of financial and legal chaos. By 1974, the walls are closing in. Warner Bros., frustrated by the management fiasco, refuses to release Badfinger's latest album. The band's income dries up completely. Pete Ham, the gentle genius who just wanted to make music, is staring at bankruptcy. His girlfriend is pregnant. He's supposed to be a successful songwriter, yet he can't even pay his bills. The stress is crushing him. April 23rd, 1975. Pete Ham received a devastating phone call from the United States. Every penny he had was gone. That night, shaken and overwhelmed, he met up with Tom Evans. The two of them went to the White Hart pub in Surrey, where Ham downed 10 whiskeys in silent despair. Evans drove him home around 3 a.m. on April 24th, 1975. A few hours later, in the garage studio of his home in Woking, Pete Ham hanged himself just 3 days before his 28th birthday. He left a suicide note addressed to his girlfriend, Anne Harriet, and her young son, Blair. In it, he expressed his love for them both and placed much of the blame for his despair on their manager, Stan Pauly. The note ended with a chilling final line. Anne, I love you. Blair, I love you. I will not be allowed to love and trust everybody. This is better. Pete. P.S. Stan Pauly is a soulless bastard. I will take him with me. 27 years old, one of the most talented songwriters of his generation, gone. The music world reacts with shock and grief. Paul McCartney is devastated. George Harrison is heartbroken. Fellow musicians who knew Pete's kindness and talent struggle to understand how it came to this. But those closest to Pete understand exactly how it came to this. The betrayal, the financial ruin, the feeling that everything he had worked for, everything he had created, had been stolen from him. The weight of it all became too much to bear. Tom Evans is shattered. He's lost his best friend, his creative partner, his brother. The guilt is overwhelming. The sense that he should have seen how desperate Pete had become, should have done something to help him. But life continues. Tom has to continue. He tries to keep Badfinger going with Joey Molland. They record new albums, tour, and try to recapture some of what they once had. But it's never the same. How could it be? The heart of the band is gone, and all the while, Without You keeps playing. Harry Nilsson's version becomes a staple of adult contemporary radio. Other artists keep recording it. The song lives on, eternal and beautiful, completely disconnected from the tragedy of its creation. In 1994, nearly 20 years after Pete's death, Mariah Carey releases her version of Without You. It's a massive hit, number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100, number 1 in over half a dozen countries. A new generation discovers the song. Carrie's powerful voice brings it to millions who've never heard Nilsson's version, who've never heard of Badfinger, who have no idea about Pete Ham and Tom Evans. Tom Evans should be celebrating. Another enormous hit, more royalties, more recognition for the song he co-wrote. But by 1983, Tom's life has become its own nightmare. The legal battles over Without You continue. Disputes over songwriting credits with Joey Molland turn bitter. The years of stress, of fighting for what is rightfully his, of watching others profit from his work while he struggles, have taken their toll. Tom is drinking heavily. His marriage is falling apart. Depression consumes him. November 19th, 1983. Richmond, London. Tom Evans walks into his garden studio, the same kind of place where Pete Ham ended his life 8 years earlier. 8 years that Tom has spent trying to hold on to something. His dignity, his rights, his sanity. He's only 36 years old, but he's tired. So tired of fighting. Tired of an industry that chews up artists and spits them out. Tired of the battles over a song that was supposed to be a blessing but became a curse. Tom Evans took his own life by hanging from a willow tree behind his home in Richmond, England. He left no note. 2 gifted songwriters, 2 gentle souls, 2 suicides in the same manner, 8 years apart, both destroyed by the very system that was supposed to celebrate and protect artistic talent. The tragedy is complete. Today, Without You is considered one of the greatest ballads ever written. It appears on lists of the best love songs of all time. It's been covered by everyone from Shirley Bassey to Glenn Campbell, from Frank Sinatra to Il Divo. It has generated millions upon millions of dollars in royalties over the decades. And Pete Ham and Tom Evans never saw any of it. Stan Polly, the manager who betrayed them, was eventually investigated by the FBI and convicted of mail fraud in an unrelated case in 1991. But by then, it was too late for Pete and Tom. The money he stole from them was never recovered. The careers he destroyed could never be rebuilt. The lives lost could never be restored. Badfinger's story has become a cautionary tale in the music industry, a stark reminder of what happens when naive artists trust the wrong people, when contracts aren't read carefully, when business acumen matters as much as talent. Music schools and artist advocacy groups use Badfinger as an example of everything that can go wrong. But their story is more than a cautionary tale. It's a tragedy in the classical sense. Talented individuals destroyed by forces beyond their control and by the very success they sought. Pete Ham's daughter, born after his death, grew up never knowing her father except through his music. Tom Evans' family was left to grieve a man who should have been celebrating his achievements instead of being broken by them. The surviving members of Badfinger, Joey Molland and Mike Gibbons, carried the weight of their friends' deaths for the rest of their lives. Yet the music endures. When you hear Without You, whether it's Nilsson's soaring version, Carrie's powerful interpretation, or any of the hundreds of other recordings, you're hearing Pete Ham at a piano, chasing a melody in the late hours of the night. You're hearing Tom Evans finding the perfect words for heartbreak. You're hearing 2 young men who believed in the power of music to express what words alone cannot. They wrote a song about the unbearable pain of losing someone you love. They couldn't have known that the song itself would become a monument to their own loss, that we would lose them, that the world would lose their future songs, their future collaborations, all the beauty they might have created if they had been protected instead of exploited.
I learned the truth at 17.
In 1975, a 23-year-old songwriter gave voice to every teenager who had ever felt invisible. What she created became the anthem for millions of outcasts, and it changed everything. To understand at 17, we need to understand Janis Ian herself. Born Janis Eddie Fink in 1951, she wasn't your typical teenager. By age 14, she had already written her first hit, Society's Child, a controversial song about interracial dating that brought her both fame and death threats. But success didn't shield her from the universal pain of adolescence. Like so many young people, Janis experienced the brutal social hierarchies of high school firsthand. She watched the popular girls glide through the hallways while she sat on the sidelines. She saw how beauty and social status created invisible walls between the haves and the have-nots. The spark for At 17 came from an unexpected source. Janis was reading the New York Times when she came across an article about a young woman who believed her life would transform after her debutante ball. This girl thought that one magical night would change everything, that it would open doors, bring romance, and secure her place in society. But after the ball, reality set in. Nothing had changed. The promised transformation never materialized, and she was left with crushing disappointment. That story resonated deeply with Janis. Here was someone from a completely different social class, a debutante, someone who should have had everything, yet she was experiencing the same disillusionment, the same gap between expectation and reality. Janis took that seed of an idea and merged it with her own experiences of teenage isolation. Interestingly, the girl in the article was 18, but Janis changed it to 17 to fit the rhythm of the samba guitar instrumental she'd been working on. That small creative choice gave us one of the most memorable song titles in pop music history. When Janis sat down to write at 17 in the early 1970s, she was 23 years old enough to look back with perspective, but close enough to remember every sting. The song captures something remarkable, the voice of experience reflecting on teenage pain, offering both honesty and hard-won wisdom. But what exactly made this song resonate so deeply with listeners? The brilliance of At 17 lies in its unflinching honesty. From the very first line, Janis establishes the core truth. She learned the harsh realities that come with not being one of the chosen few. The song paints vivid pictures of teenage isolation. The girl in hand-me-downs watching beauty queens from afar, those painful observations of clear-skinned smiles she could never quite achieve, and the crushing awareness that popularity seemed to unlock doors she couldn't even approach. One of the most devastating lines speaks to the invisibility of being overlooked, calling phones that never ring for those who aren't part of the golden circle. It's such a specific, relatable detail that it cuts right to the heart of teenage loneliness. But here's what made the song revolutionary for its time. It didn't just describe the pain of being an outcast. It acknowledged class divides, the mythology of beauty, and the false promises that came with popularity. This wasn't just another teen heartbreak song. This was social commentary wrapped in deeply personal experience. The song speaks to those who felt invisible, touching on experiences like never receiving Valentines, never being included in the social rituals that everyone else seemed to take for granted. Janis sings about inventing lovers on the phone, that heartbreaking image of pretending to have what others have naturally, of performing normalcy while feeling profoundly alone. But she does so without self-pity. Instead, there's a clear-eyed understanding of how teenage social dynamics work and, more importantly, how they fail us. When she describes remembering those who win the game, there's both observation and prophecy. She's watching the social hierarchy from the outside, but she's also beginning to understand that the game itself is rigged and temporary. What strikes listeners most is the authenticity. Janis wasn't writing from imagination. She was writing from memory, from scars that hadn't quite healed, and millions of people heard their own stories in her words. Here's where At 17 transcends typical sad songs about high school. The final verses offer a revelation that catches listeners off guard. Janis sings about how those who seem to win the game often lose in the long run, while the so-called ugly ducklings eventually discover their own worth. This wasn't just consolation, it was truth-telling. The popular girls with everything going for them, life doesn't always continue on that trajectory. The quiet kids reading in corners, they often find their voices later. The ones who learned to survive without external validation, they developed inner strength that served them far better than a perfect smile ever could. This perspective shift is what makes the song so powerful for adult listeners. It's not just nostalgia, it's vindication. It's permission to rewrite the narrative of those painful years. When At 17 was released in July 1975, it climbed to number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100 and hit number 1 on the Adult Contemporary chart. But more importantly, it struck a cultural nerve. This wasn't just a popular song, it became a movement. Janis Ian performed At 17 on the very first episode of Saturday Night Live on October 11th, 1975. Think about that. When SNL was making history with its debut broadcast, this song was there, cementing its place in American pop culture. The following year, Janis won the Grammy Award for Best Pop Vocal Performance Female, beating out heavy hitters like Olivia Newton-John and Linda Ronstadt. The music industry was acknowledging what millions of listeners already knew. This song mattered. The cultural impact didn't stop there. At 17 has been referenced in The Simpsons, quoted in the movie Mean Girls, where a character is actually named Janis Ian as a tribute, and featured in 30 Rock. The song became shorthand for teenage alienation and the redemption that comes with maturity. But here's the story that brings tears to my eyes every time I tell it. Remember how the song mentions Valentines I never knew? That single line represented all the teenage moments Janis had missed. The tokens of affection, the acknowledgement, the feeling of being chosen. After At 17 became a massive hit, something extraordinary happened. In 1977, Janis Ian reportedly received hundreds of Valentine's Day cards from fans. These weren't just fan mail, they were Valentines. Real, heartfelt Valentines from people across the country who wanted to make up for the ones she never received as a teenager. Think about what that means. Thousands of people heard her pain, recognized it as their own, and then collectively decided to heal that wound. They sent her the Valentines she never got. They told her she mattered. They proved that the outcasts and the overlooked could find each other across the airwaves and create their own community of acceptance. This is the true legacy of At 17, not just a hit song, but a bridge between isolated souls who finally found their anthem. So what can we take away from the story of At 17? First, that pain transformed into art can heal not just the artist, but millions of others carrying similar wounds. Second, that the teenage hierarchies that seem so permanent are actually temporary. Real life has a way of leveling the playing field. Third, that vulnerability and honesty in music create connections that slick production and empty lyrics never can. And finally, that sometimes the outcasts grow up to be the ones who change the culture. Janis Ian took her teenage pain and turned it into a Grammy-winning masterpiece that has comforted generations of listeners. Those Valentines she finally received in 1977 weren't just cards. They were proof that being honest about our wounds can create unexpected beauty. There's a song you've probably heard 100 times, maybe more. A simple melody, a father's voice, a son's voice, and a lifetime in between. Cats in the Cradle isn't just a song. It's a wake-up call, a mirror, a confession. But behind those familiar lyrics is a deeper story, one of love, of regret, and of a man who didn't realize he was writing the soundtrack to his own fate. That man was Harry Forster Chapin, a name etched into the heart of 1970s folk rock. Born on December 7th, 1942, Harry Chapin was more than just a singer-songwriter. He was a philanthropist, a hunger activist, and a passionate believer in using music to make the world better. Over the course of his career, he achieved worldwide success, selling more than 16 million records. He earned a Grammy Award and was later inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame, honors that reflected both his musical brilliance and the emotional power of his storytelling. What many listeners don't know is that Harry Chapin didn't write the original lyrics. His wife, Sandy Chapin, did. Sandy was a poet, a woman finely attuned to the emotional currents of everyday life. In the early 1970s, she penned a poem about a father who was too busy for his child, only to grow old and realize the child had become just like him, distant, unavailable, and burdened with the same responsibilities. The inspiration came partly from her first marriage and partly from observing a friend newly navigating fatherhood. The poem was raw and truthful, and it sat untouched until Harry found it. The moment he read it, something clicked. "This is a song," Harry said, "and I have to write it." What followed was more than an adaptation. It was a transformation. He reshaped the lines into verses, added a haunting melody, and gave the piece emotional momentum. The result was Cats in the Cradle, a song that would become his most iconic and prophetic work. Cats in the Cradle takes us through a life in fast forward. A baby is born, the father's too busy. The child grows, the father remains unavailable. Time passes. Suddenly the child is a man. And the father, now old and longing for connection, hears his own words echoed back to him. "I'd love to, Dad, if I could find the time." The most painful line? He'd grown up just like me. It's more than poetic. It's tragic. The chorus, "The cat's in the cradle and the silver spoon, little boy blue and the man in the moon," sounds gentle, almost like a lullaby. But as the song progresses, it becomes a quiet scream, a ticking clock. Childhood passes quickly. The song reminds us, you don't know what you're losing until the years are gone. Released in 1974 as part of the album Verities and Balderdash, the song shot to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 by December. It wasn't just a hit, it became part of the cultural fabric. It played on radios, in living rooms, in long car rides, and late at night when people thought about the calls they hadn't made. Fathers wept quietly in silence. Sons listened and wondered about their future. It struck a nerve. Yet despite the deeply emotional narrative in Cats in the Cradle, the truth about Harry Chapin's own family life tells a different story. Harry had a loving and attentive relationship with his children, particularly his son, Joshua Chapin. He often emphasized in interviews that the song was not autobiographical. In fact, the original lyrics came from Sandy Chapin's own observations and past experiences, including the difficult relationship between her first husband and his father. Still, Harry understood the emotional weight of the song. He admitted that it haunted him because even though the story wasn't about him, it could become his story if he wasn't careful. As a touring musician, Chapin spent long stretches on the road, but he made a conscious effort not to let his work rob him of fatherhood. He was determined not to become the man in the song. Joshua Chapin and other family members have since spoken about Harry's deep commitment to being present as a father, whether it was carving out moments during his tours to call home or creating time between shows to be with his kids. Chapin worked hard to avoid the regrets portrayed in his own music. The song for him was a cautionary tale, not a confession. And then, in 1981, the story turned tragic. On July 16, Harry Chapin was killed in a car accident on the Long Island Expressway. He was just 38 years old. The man who had written so hauntingly about time lost ran out of time himself. He left behind his wife, his children, his music, and a legacy that would outlive him in heartbreaking ways. Harry's death was more than a loss to music. It was a loss to activism, too. Few know that he had helped found World Hunger Year, a nonprofit dedicated to ending hunger and poverty. He donated much of his income to charity and often played benefit concerts. At the time of his death, it's estimated that half his concerts were for causes, not profit. In many ways, he lived as urgently as he sang, trying to make the most of every day. But even he couldn't escape the warning buried inside his most famous song. And then, more than a decade later, a new generation discovered Cats in the Cradle, but not through folk radio or acoustic records. This time, it came through electric guitars and snarling vocals. Enter Ugly Kid Joe. In 1992, the alternative metal band released a gritty, rock-infused cover of the song on their debut album, America's Least Wanted. Known more for their sarcasm and rebellious energy, the choice was unexpected. But their version, stripped of irony and full of raw emotion, hit just as hard. Lead singer Whitfield Crane gave the lyrics a darker, desperate edge, and the distortion-heavy arrangement underscored the frustration at the heart of the song. Ugly Kid Joe's cover reached #6 on the Billboard Hot 100 and was played in heavy rotation on MTV. For a whole new generation, teenagers navigating broken homes and distant parents, it was their first experience of Chapin's message. And despite the genre shift, the song's soul remained intact. Its pain, its warning, its quiet devastation, all still there. That cover proved something important. Great songwriting transcends style. Whether it's played on a gentle acoustic or screamed over distorted amps, the story hits home. The regret is the same. The mirror still reflects. Cats in the Cradle lives on because it speaks to something universal. At its core, it's not just a song about a father and son. It's a mirror held up to anyone who's ever said, "not now," one too many times. It captures the small, silent tragedies of everyday life. The postponed phone call, the missed birthday, the quiet moments we meant to share but let slip by. It reminds us that love isn't just about feeling, it's about showing up. It's about time. And time is the one thing we never get back. The song echoes with a warning most of us don't hear until it's too late, that the people we care about won't always be waiting, that our roles in life, child, parent, friend, shift while we're busy. It reveals the painful irony that we often become the very thing we once resented, simply by default, by distraction, or by delay. Cats in the Cradle stays with us because it doesn't shout, it whispers. It doesn't accuse, it reflects. And in that reflection, many of us see our own lives, our own regrets, our own missed chances. That's what gives it its power. That's why, decade after decade, it continues to strike a chord. Because beneath its haunting melody lies an inescapable truth. Love needs presence, not promises. Time is the currency of connection. And once it's gone, no apology, no gesture, no song can buy it back. So whether you hear it through Harry Chapin's tender voice or Ugly Kid Joe's anguished roar, the message is clear. Call them now. Show up now. Make time now. Because once the cradle rocks empty and the voice on the other end says, "I'd love to, Dad, if I could find the time," it may already be too late. In 1972, Neil Young released a 2-minute song that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was a desperate warning to a friend spiraling into addiction. 6 months later, that friend was dead. This isn't just another song analysis. It's a story of friendship, addiction, and how one of music's greatest artists tried and failed to save the people he loved. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Neil Young still can't perform this song without emotion in his voice, more than 50 years later. Stick around, because the real tragedy runs deeper than you might think. To understand this song, we need to go back to 1968. Neil Young had just left Buffalo Springfield and was beginning his solo career. But he didn't want to do it alone. He needed a band, and he found the perfect one already formed. Crazy Horse. At the heart of Crazy Horse was Danny Whitten, rhythm guitarist, occasional lead vocalist, and, by all accounts, one of the most naturally talented musicians of his generation. Listen to early Crazy Horse records, and you'll hear Whitten's soulful voice and instinctive guitar work. Neil and Danny clicked immediately. Together, they created some of the rawest, most honest rock and roll ever recorded. Songs like Cinnamon Girl, Down by the River, and Cowgirl in the Sand. These weren't just Neil Young songs. They were collaborations with Whitten's contributions essential to that primal Crazy Horse sound. But behind the music, Danny was fighting a battle he was losing. By 1970, heroin had entered the picture, and everything was about to change. The late 60s and early 70s were a dangerous time in rock and roll. Heroin was everywhere, backstage, in hotel rooms, in recording studios. It claimed Janis Joplin in 1970 and Jim Morrison in 1971. And it was destroying Danny Whitten piece by piece. Neil Young watched his friend deteriorate. Whitten's playing became unreliable. He'd miss notes, forget lyrics, show up late, or not at all. For someone as naturally gifted as Danny, it was devastating to witness. In early 1972, Neil was preparing for a massive tour to support his upcoming album, Harvest. He wanted Danny there. He always wanted Danny there. So he invited Whitten to rehearsals, but Danny couldn't do it. He couldn't remember the songs. He couldn't play. The heroin had taken everything. Neil faced an impossible choice: continue with a friend who couldn't perform, or let him go. On November 18, 1972, Neil Young made one of the hardest decisions of his life. He fired Danny Whitten, gave him $50 and a plane ticket home to Los Angeles. That night, Danny Whitten died of an overdose. He was 29 years old. The official cause was an overdose of alcohol and Valium. But Neil Young has never forgiven himself. He's said in interviews that he felt responsible, that by sending Danny away, he had sent him to his death. But The Needle and the Damage Done wasn't written after Danny died. It was written before, as a warning that came too late. Neil Young wrote The Needle and the Damage Done in 1971, a full year before Danny Whitten died. He'd been watching the destruction heroin was causing, not just to Danny, but to others in his circle. The song was recorded simply, just Neil, his acoustic guitar, and his harmonica. No production tricks, no overdubs, just raw honesty. The lyrics are devastatingly direct. I can't quote them here, but they speak of watching someone fade away, of seeing the damage accumulate, of feeling helpless. It's only 2 minutes long, but those 2 minutes contain more truth about addiction than most documentaries. When Harvest was released in February 1972, The Needle and the Damage Done was there. Track 5 on side 2. Critics praised its stark honesty. Fans connected with its emotion. But for the people it was meant to save, it changed nothing. Danny Whitten heard the song. He knew it was about him and others like him. And still, he couldn't stop. If this story is resonating with you, if you've ever known someone trapped by addiction, please hit that like button and subscribe to Track's Backstory. We're dedicated to telling the real stories behind the music. Danny Whitten's death would have been enough to haunt anyone for a lifetime. But the needle wasn't finished with Neil Young's circle. Bruce Berry was a roadie, one of those essential behind-the-scenes people who keep rock and roll running. He worked for Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, setting up equipment and making sure everything worked. Neil knew him well, considered him a friend. Bruce Berry was also struggling with heroin addiction. And despite everything that had happened with Danny, despite the warning of the needle and the damage done, Bruce couldn't escape either. In June 1973, just 7 months after Danny Whitten's death, Bruce Berry overdosed and died. He was 24 years old. This second loss devastated Neil Young. It led directly to one of his darkest, most anguished albums, Tonight's the Night. The entire album is essentially a wake for Danny and Bruce, recorded in a haze of grief and tequila. The title track specifically mentions Bruce Berry by name. Neil wasn't hiding anymore. He was screaming his pain and frustration into the void. 2 friends, 2 warnings, 2 failures. The needle and the damage done had accomplished nothing except documenting the tragedy as it unfolded. So why does this song still matter 50 years later? The needle and the damage done didn't save Danny Whitten or Bruce Berry. It didn't stop the heroin epidemic of the 1970s. But it did something else, something perhaps more important. It told the truth. In an era when drug use was often glamorized in rock and roll, Neil Young stripped away the mythology and showed the reality. Broken people, wasted talent, and permanent loss. The song became an anthem for anyone who'd watched addiction destroy someone they loved. Neil Young still performs this song regularly, said Ferdinand, and he still gets emotional when he does. In concert, you can hear it in his voice, the weight of those memories, the burden of survival when others didn't make it. The song also appears on the 2007 album Live at Massey Hall 1971. Young introduced it by reflecting on the many talented musicians he had seen early in their careers, some of whom were lost to heroin, and explained that this inspired him to write The Needle and the Damage Done. The song has been covered by dozens of artists. It's been used in films and documentaries about addiction. It sparked countless conversations between parents and children, friends and friends, about the realities of drug use. Maybe it didn't save the people Neil Young wanted it to save, but it saved others. The story of The Needle and the Damage Done is ultimately a story about the limits of art. We'd like to believe that the right song, the right words, can change everything, that truth and beauty can overcome addiction, save lives, and rewrite endings. But sometimes they can't. Sometimes all we can do is witness, document, and remember. Danny Whitten was a brilliant musician whose potential was never fully realized. Bruce Berry was a dedicated professional who kept the show running for others. Both died too young, victims of an epidemic that continues to this day. Neil Young's song couldn't save them, but it ensures we remember them, not just as cautionary tales, but as real people with real talent who deserve better. And maybe that's the most we can ask of any song. Thank you for watching this episode of Track's Backstory. If you want more deep dives into the stories behind the music that shaped our lives, please subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. Drop a comment below and tell us which song has the most powerful story for you. See you in the next video.